Have you ever wondered what betrayal looks like when it's dressed in elegance, spoken through a smile, and served in a crystal wine glass? That night, as candlelight flickered over polished silver and family laughter echoed through the Vaughn estate's marble dining room, I saw it, clear as day. My name is Noah Sterling. I'm a documentary filmmaker, 38. And that evening I watched my mother-in-law, Celeste Vaughn, stir something into my drink when she thought I wasn't looking. The nation knows her as the beloved voice of morality, a former broadcast icon turned social ethics advocate. But I knew something she had spent decades hiding. A soft swirl, a subtle glance over her shoulder, and a quiet whisper to me across the kitchen island. "This one's special, just for you, Noah." I smiled politely and took the glass, but as she turned away, I made a quiet decision. One I didn't announce, one that would change everything. I walked back into the dining room and gently placed the tampered glass in front of her husband, Richard Vaughn, the same man who had built half the skyline in Manhattan and who had spent years reminding me, without ever raising his voice, that I didn't belong in their family. He drank it without hesitation. 25 minutes later, his face had lost all color, and the room fell into a hush as he stumbled to the restroom, clutching his chest and his pride. Celeste's smile faded instantly. Her eyes found mine across the table, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between us. She knew, and I knew she knew. But I didn't make a scene. I didn't shout or accuse her. I simply picked up my fork and ate my dinner. Quiet, calm, watchful. What do you do when the people who are supposed to protect your family try to quietly destroy it from the inside? You document it. You wait. And then, you show the world who they really are. If you've ever questioned whether power can hide darkness, stay with me. Because this story, my story, reveals just how far people will go to keep control, and how far I went to take it back. If this resonates, subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. I read everything. And sometimes, what you write is the next story worth telling. Isabella Vaughn wasn't just the daughter of a public family. She was the crown jewel of it. Brilliant, grounded, fiercely compassionate. We met 6 years ago in Geneva, at a global summit on human rights, where I was filming a documentary about post-conflict reconciliation in East Africa. She was speaking on behalf of a nonprofit rebuilding war-torn communities. We bonded over shared values, late-night walks through empty corridors, and conversations that bled into dawn. There was no performance between us, no need to impress, just a quiet recognition that we saw the world the same way, even if we came from different versions of it. From the start, Isabella's warmth and clarity drew me in. What I didn't fully grasp then was that by falling for her, I was stepping into a family system built not on connection but on control. Her mother, Celeste Vaughn, had spent decades mastering the art of image. To the public, she was a graceful force, equal parts poise and principle. Her syndicated talk show had guided millions through their moral crossroads. To Isabella, and those close enough to see behind the curtain, she was something else entirely. I met Celeste over dinner at their brownstone on the Upper East Side. She smiled, complimented my work, even asked about my recent film on displaced communities. But beneath that polished exterior was an undercurrent of evaluation. Her eyes didn't soften with understanding. They measured. Every answer I gave felt like it was being filed, judged, categorized. Her husband, Richard, was more direct. A legacy developer, he believed in metrics, success, power, return on investment. To him, I was charming but temporary, a story Isabella would tell in her 30s with a fond smile before settling down with someone more. Aligned with the family name, they never explicitly disapproved. That would have been too obvious. Instead, they staged little reminders of the gap between us. At charity galas, I'd be introduced as Isabella's filmmaker friend. At brunches, I'd find myself seated next to assistants, not advisors. At one point, Celeste handed me a book titled Rerouting Creative Lives, Finding Stability After Art. She signed it. I still have it on my shelf, untouched, unopened, But Isabella loved me and I loved her, and so I stayed silent. I told myself it didn't matter, that their disapproval would fade once they saw I wasn't going anywhere. I poured my energy into work, into building a stable life for us. I made myself smaller, quieter, more digestible, hoping that proximity and patience would eventually buy me a seat at their table. What I didn't know then was that Celeste wasn't waiting to accept me. She was waiting for her chance to dismantle me, brick by brick, choice by choice, until the only version of me left standing was the one she had constructed in her mind and approved for public display. The first signs didn't come as explosions. They came as whispers, small, almost imperceptible cracks in the glassy surface of Celeste's perfectly constructed world. The kind you ignore at first, out of love, out of hope. I began to notice how I was gradually being edited out of the Vaughn family narrative. At Isabella's work award ceremony, Celeste gave a speech about her daughter's accomplishments. She praised Issa's compassion, intelligence, and sense of justice, then glanced at me and said, with a tight smile, "And, of course, every strong woman must learn to balance love and purpose." That was it. No mention of my support, the sacrifices I made to help Issa get to where she was, or the quiet nights spent reviewing grant proposals and helping her prep for press interviews. I wasn't a partner, I was scenery. Then came the podcast moment. Celeste was being interviewed on a top-rated lifestyle show, talking about family values and personal legacy. I listened in from my editing room, distracted until I heard the host ask, "And what about Isabella? She's married now, isn't she?" Celeste responded with a pleasant laugh. "Yes, she is, though there was a time she almost married someone from her father's world. Caleb Reed, a brilliant young Harvard law grad. Sometimes I wonder how different her path would have been." Her voice trailed off. The implication was clear. That path, in her eyes, would have been better. At a family brunch, I found myself seated next to the Vaughn's publicist, while the rest of the family sat at the main table. The menu had been pre-selected. Everyone else had the house eggs Benedict. I was served a plain omelet, unseasoned. A small detail, but when I asked for a coffee refill, the server whispered, "Sorry, sir. Mrs. Vaughn requested no service interruptions on the press side." I realized then I wasn't part of the inner circle. I was managed like a brand liability. The turning point came when I discovered a series of text messages. Isabella had left her phone on the kitchen counter while she showered, and a thread from Mom popped up. I didn't intend to read it, but when I saw the preview, "Don't let him box you into someone you're not," I opened it. The messages were layered in maternal concern but laced with passive sabotage. "He doesn't understand your caliber. I worry he's holding you back. What are his 5-year plans? Does he even think long-term? You used to be so driven. Where did that fire go?" I didn't mention the messages to Issa. I told myself she deserved the benefit of the doubt, that maybe Celeste was just being protective, that love, real love, required a thicker skin than I had grown up with. But something was shifting in me. I began to realize that what I was facing wasn't just a mother-in-law's disapproval. It was a quiet, coordinated undermining of who I was and what I meant to her daughter. It was orchestrated invisibility. Celeste didn't attack. She erased, not with volume but with strategy. Not by pushing me out, but by making it seem like I was never there to begin with. And in her world, that kind of erasure wasn't cruelty. It was correction. By the time Celeste invited us to her 60th birthday dinner, I had learned to expect subtle dismissals. I dressed well, brought an expensive bottle of Barolo, one I knew she favored, and wore the same practiced smile I'd adopted for years around her. It was easier that way. Keep the peace, play the part. Isabella had been looking forward to the evening. She even joked that maybe, just maybe, her mother was warming up to me. I wanted to believe her. We arrived at the Vaughn estate just after sunset. The dining room had been transformed into a magazine spread, white orchids trailing from antique vases, gold-leafed place cards with calligraphy names, and candles casting soft, expensive light across everything. As we settled in, Richard launched into stories about his latest real estate development in Singapore. Celeste sat at the head of the table, draped in designer silk, nodding graciously, perfectly composed. Halfway through dinner, just after the main course, Celeste stood and said she had a surprise for the dessert course, her signature sangria, a recipe she hadn't served in years. She disappeared into the kitchen. Out of habit and perhaps guilt, I stood and offered to help. She waved me off politely. "Noah," she said, her voice lilting, "this one's just for you, you've earned it." Her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. Still, I stepped into the kitchen. What I saw was not surprising, but it still chilled me. There were 2 glasses, separate from the others, already poured. Celeste was holding a small, clear vial between her fingers, tilting its contents into one of the glasses. A pale, nearly invisible shimmer floated on the surface. She moved with such ease as though this wasn't her first time. The moment she noticed me, she flinched, but recovered instantly. "Oh," she said brightly. "I didn't hear you. Just putting the finishing touch on your glass." She gave me a wink. "Special blend." My throat went dry. I said nothing. I simply walked forward, picked up both glasses, and smiled. "Let me help you carry them in." She hesitated, just for a breath, then nodded. Back at the table, I placed the spiked glass in front of Richard. I took the clean one for myself. No one noticed. Richard barely looked up from his phone as he took a sip. 20 minutes later, he was pale, sweating, and stumbling toward the hallway bathroom. His groans echoed down the corridor like a man drowning slowly in his own body. Celeste's face drained of color. Our eyes met, and in that moment I saw it clearly, not guilt, not fear, recognition. She knew I knew, but I didn't accuse her. I didn't stand, shout, or slam the table. I simply reached for my water, took a slow sip, and began counting down the seconds to my next move, because now I had what she feared most. I left the Vaughn estate that night with a single glass sealed inside a travel case I usually used for delicate camera lenses. The residue on its surface was faint, but I knew what I had seen. I didn't sleep. Instead, I sat in my home office with that glass on the desk in front of me, replaying every second of Celeste's performance, every smile, every phrase, every calculated word. I'd spent years studying dictators, war criminals, corrupt diplomats, people who lived behind curated personas. Now I realized I had missed the one standing 10 feet from me, dressed in silk, and holding a wine glass. The next morning, I called an old friend, Dr. Miles Brennan, a chemist who had consulted on one of my investigative documentaries. He agreed to test the sample without asking too many questions. "Professional or personal?" he asked lightly. "Both," I said, "and possibly criminal." I delivered the sample by noon. 3 days later, I got his call. Miles didn't waste time. "There are benzodiazepines in that glass, Noah. Not fatal, but in the right dose, it would induce disorientation, slowed speech, blurred memory, and intense nausea. Whoever drank it would look like they were drunk or worse." "How did you get this?" I paused, then said, "Let's just say someone thought I needed to miss a dinner." I didn't tell Isabella, not yet. She had grown up idolizing her mother, and despite the strained undercurrents between us, I knew she still wanted to believe there was good beneath Celeste's sharp edges. I needed more than one lab result. I needed a pattern. I started digging. Quietly. Through public medical databases and private access I had gained over the years, I learned that Celeste Vaughn held multiple prescriptions for anxiety medication under slightly varied versions of her name in 3 different states. The doctors prescribing them didn't know about one another. Some had since lost their licenses. A few were still practicing. But that wasn't the worst of it. An old news archive from 15 years ago mentioned an internal inquiry at her former network. Back then, she was co-hosting a political ethics program. The inquiry was closed, sealed, but a whisper remained in the industry forums. Allegations of psychological manipulation, a young producer who abruptly quit and later posted a cryptic message online, You think she speaks for truth. She speaks to control. I remembered that line clearly. Because as I read it, I felt my spine tighten. I went further. I contacted 2 past boyfriends of Isabella's, one from her college years, another during grad school. Both were reluctant. Both asked not to be named. But both told the same story in different words. Celeste had visited them, privately, spoken in polite threats, suggested they were distractions, that Isabella had obligations, legacy. One of them mentioned receiving anonymous accusations of harassment at work within weeks of breaking up with her. Nothing was ever proven, but everything unraveled. Celeste didn't scream. She didn't threaten. She planted quiet seeds and waited for them to grow. Now, I wasn't just another man being tested. I was a liability being removed. But what she hadn't counted on was that I knew how to document the truth. Patiently, invisibly, permanently. She had tried to sedate me into silence. What she didn't know was that she'd only awakened the part of me trained to uncover people exactly like her. It's a strange thing. Realizing the person you thought was simply overbearing is in fact dangerous. Celeste Vaughn had mastered her public image with surgical precision. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had made a career out of telling other people how to live. She was the Sunday morning comfort of a nation sipping coffee. Her quotes circulated on parenting blogs. Her smile was framed in waiting rooms across the country. She had become, quite literally, the image of trust. But behind that voice, behind the flawless studio makeup and carefully staged family photos, was a woman who operated in shadows. And as I looked deeper, the shadows only widened. The first real break came from someone I didn't expect. Vanessa, my sister-in-law. Married to Isabella's older brother, she had always seemed quiet at family gatherings, pleasant but distant. We were never particularly close. Then one afternoon I received a package. No return address, just a USB drive inside a padded envelope, along with a note in clean handwriting that said, "You need to see this." The files were dated 2 nights after the birthday dinner. The first video was from inside the Vaughn home. Security footage, clearly from their own system. I watched as Celeste stood in the kitchen preparing drinks. I saw the moment I had witnessed with my own eyes. The vial, the glass, the quiet calculation. Then, minutes later, Richard doubling over, stumbling away from the table. But the next video was what made my blood run cold. It showed Celeste alone in the kitchen after dinner, pacing, furious. Richard entered off camera. "You gave him the wrong glass," she snapped. "I didn't touch the damn glasses, Celeste," he growled. "You were supposed to distract him." "Are you hearing yourself? This isn't the first time," she hissed. "And if you hadn't interfered, it would have worked." I watched it twice, then 3 times. This wasn't just about me. It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment decision. It was a pattern, calculated sabotage, weaponized civility. It was how she handled what she couldn't control. And Richard, he wasn't innocent. He was complicit, passive perhaps, but fully aware. Called Vanessa the next day. She answered on the second ring. "Why did you send this?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Because I know what it's like. They tried to do it to me too." She told me about her early days dating Owen Vaughn, how Celeste had pulled her aside and said, "The Vaughns marry ambition, not appearance." How Richard had accidentally leaked a story to a gossip blog about Vanessa's family debts. How she and Owen had nearly broken up twice. Each time, Celeste would suddenly become affectionate, helpful, even maternal. Vanessa admitted it had taken her years to realize the manipulation wasn't reactive. It was strategy. "But why now?" I asked. "Because you're not just a threat," she said. "You're documenting it. That terrifies her." Her words echoed in my head for days. And then another name surfaced. Dr. Caleb Reed. He was the ex Celeste had mentioned in passing before, always framed as the almost son-in-law they respected. A clean-cut, brilliant Harvard law graduate who had allegedly broken Isabella's heart. I had never met him. He was a ghost in the family scrapbook. I found him through a colleague in Boston. Reached out. At first he refused to talk. Then he agreed to a call. She turned Isabella against me, he said flatly. One day we were planning our future. The next she thought I was cheating on her with a grad student. I wasn't, but Celeste had printed screenshots of fake messages. She made it look like I'd been messaging someone from my clinic. It destroyed everything. Why didn't you fight back? I asked. I tried, he said. But you can't fight someone who controls the narrative. And Celeste, she doesn't argue, she erases. As I hung up, one thing became clear. Celeste had done this before. She had a blueprint. She identified what made people vulnerable and she pressed until they broke. But this time she had chosen the wrong target. Because I wasn't just her son-in-law. I was a storyteller with a camera, a network, and now, undeniable proof. She had tried to remove me from Isabella's life. Now I was going to show Isabella who her mother really was. Frame by frame, word by word, lie by lie. After that call with Caleb, everything shifted. What had once been a quiet investigation, rooted in curiosity, became something else, a mission of preservation. Not for me, but for Isabella. She deserved to know the truth. Not a confrontation, not a scandal, but a mirror held up to the woman who had shaped her view of love, power, and control. And I knew I couldn't tell her outright. I had seen what Celeste could do with denial, with doubt. Isabella wouldn't believe me until she had no other choice. So I built the case like I would build a film. Carefully, invisibly, with structure. The first thing I did was catalog every interaction I had with Celeste since the engagement. I pulled emails, messages, and old voicemails. In one of them, Celeste had left a kind reminder to Isabella that, "Noah's not from our world, darling. He may not understand how these things work." That line became a thematic through line. Then I collected third-party accounts, Caleb's testimony, Vanessa's story, and even one from a former assistant of Celeste's, who told me under condition of anonymity that she'd once been instructed to leak a controlled rumor to damage someone's credibility during a contract negotiation. I recorded our call, I had videos, I had voice, I had a timeline. But that wasn't enough. I needed clarity, so I sat down with my editor, Daniel, a colleague from my last feature. I didn't tell him it was personal. I told him it was for an expose on legacy media manipulation and private ethics. He agreed to help. Over the next 2 weeks, we shaped everything into a 1-hour private documentary, never intended for broadcast. It had a beginning, the image of Celeste pouring something into my glass. A middle, the testimony of those she'd quietly crushed. And an end, the raw video of her yelling at Richard, admitting to intent. It was quiet, crisp, professional. No voiceover, just truth, stitched together with subtitles and silence. While that was in progress, I made another move. I filed a formal SAWS request for Celeste's prescription records in Massachusetts under public health transparency laws, using legal access granted to investigative filmmakers. The results confirmed what I had suspected. 3 active prescriptions for benzodiazepines filled within 5 days of one another, each from a different provider. All concealed under different legal first names, Celeste M. Vaughn, C. M. Vaughn, and Monsieur Vaughn. It wasn't illegal, but it was deliberate. Then came the final piece. Celeste had been working on a new book, Moral Clarity in a Noisy World, with a publisher known for high-profile political memoirs. I reached out to one of their junior editors, someone I had worked with years ago. Off the record, she shared that Celeste had demanded full editorial control, no fact-checking on her past, and a final say on which family stories were included. She's building a legacy, the editor told me, something she can control after she's gone. I had the footage, the files, the words. All I needed now was the audience. I invited Isabella, Vanessa, and Owen, Isa's brother, to dinner at our home. No fanfare, just a quiet night. I told Isa I wanted to show her something I'd been working on. She assumed it was another film. When the lights dimmed and the first image flickered onto the screen, Celeste's hand swirling that glass, I watched Isabella's posture change. Her breath caught. Vanessa gripped Owen's hand. No one spoke for 62 minutes. When it ended, Isabella turned to me. Her voice was thin. "Why didn't you show me this sooner?" "Because I needed you to see it all at once," I said. "Not pieces, not rumors, the full weight of it." She sat in silence for a moment. Then she stood up and left the room. Vanessa followed her. Owen stayed behind, pale. "That can't be our mother," he muttered. "That's not her." "Maybe not the version she showed you," I said. "But that's the one she's been hiding." The next morning, Isabella came back into the kitchen holding her phone. "She just called," she said. "Said you've been turning me against her, that you're jealous of our family." I waited, but I didn't answer her. She slid the phone into her pocket. Her eyes found mine. "I want to talk to her," she said. "Face to face. No cameras, just us. But I want you there." I nodded. Not as a director, not even as a husband, but as a witness. Because once you know the truth, you can't unsee it. You can only choose whether you'll keep pretending or finally speak it aloud. We arrived at the Vaughn estate just before 7:15 p.m., walking into a house that looked like it had been staged for a magazine cover. There was soft music playing in the background, candles lit on the hallway console, and the subtle scent of jasmine in the air. You wouldn't have guessed walking in that this was the home of a woman who had, not long ago, tried to sedate her own son-in-law under the guise of civility. Celeste met us at the door, wearing a navy wrap dress that matched the tone of her voice. Calm, deliberate, polished. "Isabella," she said as if nothing had happened, her arms opening for an embrace. Isabella didn't move. "Let's just sit," she said, stepping past her mother and into the living room. I followed, briefcase in hand, not because I intended to show evidence tonight, but because I wanted them to see it. To know it was always there, ready to surface. Richard joined us a minute later, his posture stiff, the same political neutrality he always wore during family conflict. We sat. The room fell into a long, glassy silence. Isabella was the first to speak. "Mom, I know what you did." Celeste smiled faintly, tilting her head. "Darling, you're going to have to be more specific. I saw the footage, the vial, the way you looked when Dad took the glass. You drugged Noah. You wanted him to miss the dinner, look irresponsible. And for what? So I'd doubt him?" The smile didn't falter, but the air shifted. Celeste sat up straighter. "That's absurd." Richard cleared his throat. "This sounds like a misunderstanding." "No," Isabella cut in sharply. "This isn't a misunderstanding, this is a pattern. I've spoken to Caleb, I've seen the emails. I know what you did to Vanessa, and to every man I ever dated who didn't fit your narrative." Celeste's voice lowered. "You don't know what I've protected you from. I know what you've controlled me through," Isabella said, "and I'm done letting you do it." Vanessa and Owen entered then, right on cue. Vanessa carried a small white box, which she placed on the table in front of us. Inside was a hard drive, neatly labeled with the date. "This has everything," she said. "The footage, the lab results, voice memos, screenshots of messages Celeste sent me when I was dating Owen, warning me that I wasn't refined enough for a public family. And what's worse, telling me that if I truly loved him, I would walk away before embarrassing him long-term." Owen looked like he'd aged 10 years in a week. "I didn't believe her when she first told me," he said quietly. "I thought Vanessa was overreacting. But now, I can't ignore it anymore." Celeste finally broke her stillness. She looked from face to face, at the family she had curated like a brand, now sitting across from her like a jury. "I raised you all to think for yourselves," she said slowly. "No," Isabella replied. "You raised us to think like you. And when we didn't, you punished us in ways so subtle we didn't even realize we were bleeding." Richard stood defensive. "You've built this on whispers and edited videos?" "No," I said calmly. "We built it on patterns, repeated behavior, consistent manipulation. Celeste looked at me with that old glint of disdain. You've always wanted to turn Isabella against me. You resented the influence I had. No, I said again, evenly. I resented the control you refused to admit to. Then Isabella leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. This isn't a confrontation. This is a boundary. From this day forward, you don't get to dictate who I love or how I live or what my family looks like. And you don't get to rewrite history just because you're uncomfortable with how it actually unfolded, Vanessa added. We're not asking for your apology, just your silence. Richard's voice was colder now. And what happens if we don't respect that? Owen finally looked up. Then you'll lose all of us. Celeste's hands clenched, faintly in her lap. Her face hardened, but she said nothing more. We left without saying goodbye. That night, Isabella sat at the foot of our bed for a long time, staring out the window, her phone on silent. When I sat beside her, she said, I used to believe I owed my parents everything, my education, my strength, even my choices. And now? I asked. She turned toward me. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was firm. Now I know the only thing I ever owed them was the truth, and I gave it to them tonight. That's what happens when the truth finally hits the table. No yelling, no chaos, just the sharp, clean cut of clarity. It doesn't always make things right, but it makes them real. And sometimes that's the only way to begin again. In the days that followed, there was no apology, no letter, no acknowledgement from Celeste or Richard. But there was a shift, a silence that, in a family like the Vaughns, said more than words ever could. For the first time since I had entered their world, no one reached out to check in. No carefully worded invitations to brunch, no veiled questions about our future. It was as if we'd flipped a switch, and in doing so, rendered ourselves invisible to them. By choice. At first, the quiet unnerved Isabella. For years, even their disapproval had been a kind of contact, a tether, however painful. Now that the tether was severed, she was adrift. But only for a moment. Because something else was growing in its place, clarity. For the first time, her life was her own. No editing, no staging, just truth. 3 weeks later, a certified envelope arrived by courier. It was addressed to both of us. Inside were 2 documents, a deed transfer and a trust agreement. The penthouse apartment we had been renting, one of Richard's properties, was now ours. Fully signed over. No strings, no stipulations, no explanatory note. The trust was in the name of our unborn child. We sat with the papers in silence. Isabella ran her fingers over the embossed letterhead, then looked at me. It's not an apology, she said. No, I replied. But it's a surrender. I didn't tell her that I knew exactly why it had come now. Just a few days earlier, Celeste's upcoming book had been quietly dropped by her publisher. I hadn't leaked anything, but perhaps someone else had. Maybe a conscience finally stirred. Maybe it was just a strategic retreat. Either way, the damage was done. Not publicly, not in headlines, but in the quiet unraveling of a myth they had spent decades building. That spring, Isabella gave birth to our daughter. We named her Eliana, which means God has answered. She came into the world wide-eyed and calm, with Isabella's quiet strength and, I hoped, none of her grandmother's need for control. Celeste and Richard visited the hospital, but it wasn't a performance. They stayed 15 minutes. They brought flowers, not photographers. Celeste asked to hold Eliana. Isabella handed her over without speaking. And for the first time, I saw something flicker across Celeste's face. Not remorse, but restraint. She kissed Eliana's forehead and passed her back. No advice, no commentary, just silence. Over the following months, we kept our distance. The Vaughns reached out occasionally. Emails, brief messages, but never crossing boundaries we hadn't invited. At first, I expected it to be temporary. A pause before the old games resumed. But the games didn't come back. Something else did. 1. evening, as I was editing a new project in my studio, a short film on dignity and aging, I received a delivery. A hardback book, glossy and thick, no note, just a silver ribbon. It was Richard Vaughn's annual real estate report, a prestige piece he sent to select investors and clients. As I flipped through it, something caught my eye. My photographs, landscapes I had shot in Patagonia, portraits I'd taken of architects for a separate campaign, architectural details from cities I'd documented over a decade, all used, credited, to my name, professionally sourced. I stared at the pages for a long time. On the last page, beneath a caption that read, "Legacy through Vision," there was a single line of text, "Photography by the best storyteller I know." I didn't call to say thank you. I didn't need to, because this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about power, and who holds it, not in headlines or bank accounts, but in the quiet way we choose to live. Celeste and Richard hadn't changed, but they had finally understood something, that the game they'd been playing all these years, I was no longer a piece on their board, and Eliana, she would never be. In the end, I didn't destroy Celeste Vaughn. I didn't expose her on national television or release a damning documentary to the public. I didn't need to, because justice, I've come to understand, isn't always loud. It's not always about courtrooms or confrontation. Sometimes justice is about quietly reclaiming the space you were once forced to shrink in. It's about cutting off access, not for revenge but for survival. Celeste didn't lose her platform. She still gets invited to conferences. Her name still holds weight in certain circles. But something changed. Not in her resume, but in the room. The people who once bowed instinctively now pause. The warmth in her voice is met with careful distance. Because when truth touches power, even if whispered, the shape of everything shifts. And that's the kind of justice no headline can measure. Isabella and I don't talk much about what happened anymore. Not because we've forgotten, but because we've integrated it. It's part of our story now, not a wound, but a scar. A reminder that boundaries are not betrayals. That family doesn't mean blind loyalty. That love, real love, protects truth, even when it's inconvenient. As Eliana grows, we'll tell her the truth in pieces, at the pace she's ready for. Not to burden her, but to show her what strength looks like when it's quiet. What resilience looks like without rage. What it means to know your worth so deeply. No one else gets to define it for you. Not even the people who raised you. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that the most dangerous kind of manipulation is the one hidden, under legacy, under charm, under the illusion of care. And the only way to dismantle that is not to scream louder, but to stand firmer, to document, to hold your line, to live your truth. If this story struck something in you, if it reminded you of a silence you once kept or a role you were pushed into, don't just carry it alone. Share it. Speak it. Comment below with your experience, or the moment you decided to take your power back. I read everything, and sometimes your truth is the beginning of someone else's escape. And if you're still waiting for the courage to walk away from something that's been quietly rewriting who you are, let this be your sign. You're not crazy. You're not weak. You're just finally awake.